Flies in the Vaseline. Sometimes it blows my mind, and I always got to start with STP. And even that line is on the beginning, what is real and what's for sale, has always been a great mantra for me to stay cool. Welcome, everybody, to Gen X Wasteland. My name is Miguel Connor. I am streaming today because A, it's a special show. B, I wanted to remind you of some housekeeping on both the Aeon Byte feed and my personal YouTube channel, where I usually put Gen X Wasteland. So you're seeing it in both. And of course, there will be an audio version for thee tomorrow on various channels, including my Substack with a full show and some bonuses. So great to see everybody wherever you're watching Gen X Wasteland or wherever you're listening to it. And again, for those of you at the Aeon Byte show, please go to my website and like and subscribe there, because most of the shows are there. We've had, since last time I did the double stream, great shows. We've had shows on punk rock, shows on jazz and hermeticism. We've had shows on the issue of fascism in punk rock. We did a show on the astrological chart of Elvis Presley, and we're having great shows as we continue these views, these timeless views from the MTV generation. So today I am extremely excited to be joined by Peter Bebergal to discuss a book that really has influenced me, that's been essential with the Occult Elvis and the David Bowie book that I finally have a working first draft. Peter, thank you very much for coming on the show. Oh, yes, and the book, of course, is Season of the Witch, How the Occult Saved Rock and Roll.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here. So
great to have you, sir.
Cool. We had a terrible heat wave here in Massachusetts. I think actually you probably did also, because it was sort of a dome over everything, but it's really cooled off. So things are nice here tonight.
Yeah, we had the heat, then it cooled off, then today's 90 again. So it's relentless. It's relentless. And with us, it is always a pleasure and an honor with my friend, Dr. Sherilyn Jones joins us. Sherilyn, how are you today?
I'm doing really good. We've been spared big heat out here. It's still getting down into the 40s at night, but it'll get into the 80s during the day, which they consider a heat wave in Montana. But having grown up in Florida, I'm kind of snickering.
It's winter. Yeah, 80s near winter in Florida.
But it finally came along. We had a long, cold spring, but we're warming up. So I really look forward to the conversation and hearing about your work, Peter.
Thank you.
Definitely, same here. Well, let's start with you, Peter. You want to tell the audience a little bit about who you are and what you do in the quote-unquote real world?
Yeah. So I'm a writer, author, with a full-time university job, keeping the lights on, as it were. But I've been writing in sort of, I guess you would say, the area of a broad subject of religion, culture, and sort of the fringe and alternative elements that wind their way into that subject. I studied religion at Brandeis University, and then I did a degree in theology at Harvard Divinity School, master's in theology there. And my focus there also was in the intersection of religion, pop culture, literature. And so all of that, though, is something, that I've been interested in my whole life. I'm actually writing a book right now on growing up as what maybe some Gen X listeners will recognize as being a monster kid. I was, a fan of Creature Double Feature, Famous Monsters of Filmland, and that was a big part of my childhood. And so I was always looking sort of, I guess, in some ways outside the mainstream of where I thought things were the most interesting, and had my own sort of mostly failed explorations into consciousness expansion in the 80s, and found my way out of that. And yeah, but since grad school, I've been writing. I've done a couple of books on this subject, and various essays and articles for some in print, some online. And so these explorations continue to be of interest to me. And so it's like I was telling you before we got started, it's always nice to know that, there are certain things that I've worked on, books that I've written that continue to resonate for folks. Seem to still have some use.
Oh yeah, definitely. Again, your ideas on how rock and roll started from Season and the Witch really was a platform for the Occult Elvis, and of course you deal with Elvis. And then when I was like, well, I'm going to use Season of the Witch because I know there was obviously a lot on David Bowie for my Bowie book, and I thought it was excellent. Even there was one part where you talked about Bowie's fascination with alien Gnosticism and how Gnostic, the man who, both the man who sold the world and the man who fell the earth, all these men with Bowie falling
Yes,
from all these
exactly.
places. And I remember thinking, well, I've been studying Gnosticism for like 15 years. I wonder if he's just using that term to use it. And once I went down that rabbit hole, I was like, oh my God, Peter nailed it. God, he nailed it. The rabbit hole with Bowie and Gnosticism, it's like you couldn't have David Bowie without Gnosticism if we throw in his interest in Jung's shadow and William Burroughs. And
I mean, you might say in some ways we wouldn't have a lot of sort of contemporary religion without the Gnostic
of course,
influence, and that's an important part of, I think, being able to even talk about these things at all, is because what we're really saying is that, I mean, the broad thing that I took away from doing this, and what I continue to take away from doing this kind of research, is that nothing exists in a vacuum, and that everything's synthetic meaning a synthesis, syncretic in the sense of the way different things come together. And, that's why for me, it's important to understand that even when we talk about the occult and rock and roll, we're not, well, for myself, I'm not talking about some, a conspiratorial stream that's sort of driving the whole thing, that we're talking about individuals on their own paths with different intents, different motivations, inspired in different ways, using this material sometimes simply for commercial benefits, sometimes for deeply personal spiritual exploration, creative exploration. Sometimes those things come together in ways that actually turn out to be very fruitful. And I think, if people remember, I think it was a 2014 or 2016 Super Bowl with Madonna, where she came out in full, initiatory right, with banners and being pulled by servants on her platform. And I point out that her headdress and the way she looks very much like the Empress tarot card. And I know that for her, obviously, she's somebody who's been, as far as I know, for a very long time, been very interested in mysticism and religion, and her own version of what she calls Kabbalah, and what that group calls Kabbalah. But at the same time, being able to recognize the absolute commercial potential of that, as much as it also has a spiritual value, mixing those things in a way that is very culturally potent. And so, again, I don't think there's one way to talk about the occult and rock and roll as if there's a perfect stream that flows through the whole thing. The only thing I would say about that is that at its base, especially when rock and roll was something that was pushing up against the boundaries of what was expected musically, maybe even the boundaries of taste, the boundaries of cultural norms, that for many of those musicians, particularly in the 60s and into the 70s, was that when the music that you're doing really seems to be affecting great cultural change, and that change is happening because you're doing things in a way that seems for some to be heterodox or against the grain, it only makes sense that you would often look to non-traditional forms of spiritual and religious ideas for your own creative and spiritual life, right? So the idea of rebellion at its core reaches also into, I think, the ways in which musicians dabbled in or manipulated or exploited or simply made nods to what we would call, in broad terms, sort of the occult.
It's really well said indeed. And yeah, I think that's what I want to get to. And again, your book deals with it. And sometimes people, when I'm on podcasts talking to people, not when they read my book or they've read your book, but I tell them that rock music was never meant to be really a form of entertainment. It really is a form of spirituality. It is this fusion of blues, which is based on African animism, the drums, the trickster god, and all that, plus the idea of this Pentecostal idea of Holy Spirit. And in a way, both are this paradox that Plato said, that to be free, you have to be possessed by a god. And rock music brought this left-hand path, devil, trickster god from Africa, Papa Legu, or whatever you want to call him, plus the Holy Spirit, these two body, soul invasion, ecstatic movements, and fused them together in a way that, well, really changed the world. It was almost like it was meant to be, to deal with this post-war imperial materialistic empire, and that these early rock guys, Elvis, Little Richard, Johnny Cash, they were really high priests and shamans and pastors more than entertainers. So would you agree with it? And that's the essence of rock and roll, is this possession, neo-Pythagorean sound modality healing movement.
Yes, but also maybe not necessarily with a full intentionality on the part of the performer. I think, but following sort of how these, who their influences were, how they got to where they got to, the way in which, we talk about, like you talk about Elvis, his, the importance of the Assembly Church or Pentecostal Church, but his own interest in African American music, in the gospel music. And it's also important, though, to recognize, though, that, I think particularly for the slave religion, for their version of Christianity, they did not really create that dichotomy, though, between, say, the trickster god and the Holy Spirit. For them, the way to worship the Holy Spirit was via those same techniques and traditions, which obviously had to be done in secret, because they were seen by the white establishment, by the white Christian establishment, as being something that was tracking with what they call the devil. But for those worshipers, there was nothing devilish about it at all. Right? It was for them in some ways, really the only way to make sense of this Christian theology that was sort of imposed in many ways on them, right? And then that just transforms everything.
Yeah, and at the same time, as you can't, people were not happy with the Pentecostal movement either. Right. They were kind of the outcasts, exactly. As people used to say. They used to accuse the Pentecostals of mixing Jesus and sex. So Elvis was on the outside, no matter which way we did.
Exactly.
And we still fused them into again this really new movement. And when you couch in terms of the occult, or what is transgressive to the outsider, Elvis was always thinking of the slave and the sharecropper and the poor Southern bootlegger and all that. And that's what it was. Just like David Bowie was always reaching out to the outcast and the working class. Yep. It really was a everyman sort of spirituality, like Hermeticism was in Greco-Roman times. It was for everyone, but like you write, it was transgressive. It was about liberation and syncretism, and really, again, being possessed and finding your inner power.
Right. And I think that also that you know, for the musicians at the time, again, because the music itself, I mean, we can't dismiss, though, the fact that, you know, for somebody, let's say, like, you know, Led Zeppelin, I mean, these guys were, I think I just read recently that they were like 23 when they wrote Stairway to Heaven, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's an overplayed song, I guess, but it's still, if you think about it in the context, it's a pretty amazing piece of music. And if you think about it in the context of who they were at 23, and these are also a bunch of 23-year-old working class British kids that are suddenly wealthy beyond anything they could have imagined, right? With access to anything they wanted, and with almost a kind of, you know, except for bad press, in some ways, with access to really whatever they wanted. But that didn't come simply by luck. It came through this incredibly hard labor, right, of doing this, of playing and writing and performing this rock and roll that, you know, no, but I don't think anybody could ever do that again without it just being called ironic or a throwback, right? It was,
Right.
there's nothing, you could never do it again in quite that way. So again, while, you know, Jimmy Page in particular had an interest in magic and in Aleister Crowley specifically, and I don't know, I couldn't find in all the research that I did any evidence that he himself actually practiced any kind of magic, but that doesn't mean that he didn't believe that the music he was crafting was a form of that in its own way. And so, but I don't want to say that Jimmy Page and Robert Plant, as much as they understood consciously or unconsciously the cultural impact that they were having and the way in which they literally were changing the world, and the spiritual, you know, sort of qualities inherent at that they still weren't also purely hedonistic, crazy young men, you know, chasing girls and doing drugs and wrecking hotel rooms and all of that, right? So it, just because the shape of the thing, or the way in which you and I and Sherilyn are able to talk about these things now in these terms, which I think are have value and are true in the way in which we can talk about them now, that at the time, I don't know, again, if that intention is pure on the part of the performer. I think it's a mix of all kinds of things, you know, getting wrapped up in the moment, but at the same time, for Jimmy Page, stepping back and thinking, wow, you know, this is really causing change to occur in the world via my will. You know, like that's happening right now, you know, on this stage. And so for him to make the connection to a magical system, or to you know, somebody like Crowley, it makes sense to me. And so that's why I would never talk about it in terms of Page had a secret pact with the devil, or was secretly possessed, or there was some, you know, Illuminati conspiracy running. That, you know, none of that. First of all, what that does is it just removes all the agency from the artist, right?
Right.
All that incredible creative agency. But also because it's impossible to talk about the occult at all as if that word even means anything, right? It's hard to even talk about that, because it's a whole constellation of practices and beliefs and symbols. It's interesting. We talk about in this book, you know, I talk about the Haitian voodoo, and I talk about the Papa Legba and the African religion. And I talk about it in broad terms under the category of a book that's called How the Occult Saved Rock and Roll. But the truth be told, those aren't occult practices in the way that we think about Western esoteric practice. These are just embedded religious traditions that have magic, or some element of what we call magic, you know, as an organic part of the worship.
Yeah, well said indeed. What do you think, Sherilyn? What say you at this
And
point?
I'm over here furiously making notes. So many things have come to mind. I just, one of the first things to me is that, when people hear this word occult, I mean, and that's it's changing over time, but I think most people, when they hear occult, they hear, satanic or devil. That's the sort of the knee jerk reaction, and not just hidden, different, right? This is a hidden thing. And that's changing, as people have sort of learned more and developed a more, astute sort of viewpoint. But I do think, and as you said, all of these things take into account, we're still talking about young men with no guardrails, right? As a mother of 3 sons, ouch, that's dangerous territory. But I think that, them being, in whatever ways they were acting out of this sort of genuine sort of occult tradition, meaning Dionysian, the sense of like channeling this music and this energy, that it was so different because, if you rewind 2,000-3,000 years, if you had a Dionysian, cult, or you had, a ritual at a festival, you're also going to have an Apollonian, you're going to have, Aloysius, you're going to have all of these other more somber, introspective, more quiet, how do I be an ethical person? And you got a family to take care of, a community
Right.
to which you're responsible. You are contained. That's my anthropology background. You're contained in all of these other systems that balance that out, that make the Dionysian make sense in its place. And obviously our pendulum had swung so far to this contained, controlled grid, that when this thing broke out, and to the point of, it being, however, to whatever extent it was manipulated or strings were being pulled, and you could look at all, as so many people call him, the late, great Dave McGowan, his work about Laurel Canyon. I think what any of these, whoever these puppet masters may have been or are, that they quickly find out that you can only contain that spirit so far. You might think you can, okay, now we're going to turn this switch and have her wear that headdress on this day and da-da-da. But the fact of the matter is that you don't control the divine. You don't control the supernatural. You're only going to channel that thing to your specific end so far, I believe, so no matter what kind of little spin powers that want to be have put on it, some really incredible music has been made that has changed people's lives forever in positive ways, and maybe it caused them to go through a dark time before it, but it's transformed people's lives in a way that you can't just market and contain and, make a statistic of. So you have to appreciate it for that.
But it's also, but the danger there also is, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah.
The danger there is also that I think there's a parallel to be made with the ways in which what I call the occult imagination can lead to its own kind of excesses, and the way that the drug culture ultimately led also to its own kinds of excesses. That there is inherent a dangerous potential in here, whether it's psychological or spiritual or physical. I mean, we know, David Bowie later would talk about this in very redemptive terms, but he went through a phase where he sort of felt that there was a value in a fascistic sort of way of performing, and felt that that you could, the way in which fascism historically was able to control people, that was something that the rock musician could take advantage of, and he played a lot with that in terms of even some of the fashion. That was something that we also see would happen. I'm not sure if you talked about this on your show about fascism punk rock, which I'll have to go back and listen to, but later the industrial underground music would play with some of that. It's still an ongoing thing that people are, debating, and there's a lot of, there's a lot of bad blood between a lot of underground music cultures right now. What people see as a continued fascistic sort of sensibility on the part of some of these musicians. And so, for David Bowie, that became that dark, and also, of course, the cocaine. He really went down a road of spiritual and physical excess, which I think you're right is part of that Orpheus path, right? You have to descend, and if we want to follow those archetypes, the artist has to descend into the underworld, but they don't always make it back. I really do think that Bowie is an astonishing figure in all of this, because not only do I think he really represents, I don't want to talk about magic necessarily or the occult in any kind of literal way, but I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that if there was any sort of true magician in the history of rock and roll, then David Bowie sort of fits that characteristic. Again, not because he was so much personally, whether or not he was casting spells or not is irrelevant. It's that the art was the spell, and it worked, right? That's all we have to know, is that it worked. And so that I think is a much more interesting way of trying to understand when we talk about occult intents, or how these things, quote, it's a little bit hyperbole to say, the subtitle of my book, saved rock and roll, but certainly forever changed it, right? I think you could do a history of rock and roll and never talk about the occult. And people have been doing it for generations, and and I in no way think that telling this part of the story is changing any of that. It's just a thread through that I don't think for a long time was really understood, or that people felt was worth exploring. And even some of the musicians that I knew were involved in their own lives, in whether practice or the way in which they promoted their music, would not interview with me, because they even said they didn't want people to misunderstand, that they just knew it was going to be exploited by somebody, and they were going to be called a Satanist, and they didn't want to get into it, Yeah.
That's go ahead, Cheryl.
I'm sorry, somebody had asked in the chat, beyond the nuanced definition of the occult, who would want to be possessed? How is this, what in that is valuable? And I think that, if you look at different, voodoo rituals, or even actually as a young woman, as a late teenager, young woman, my former in-laws were involved in the Pentecostal church. And my observation of that now, perspective years later, is that it looked more like a voodoo ritual, in the sense of they would actually kind of call the demons in and then banish that, is this draw it in with the music and then push it back out with this power. And if you look at a voodoo ritual, they're not calling the demons or the gods and then just letting them stay possessed. They have to go back out. You can't walk around in that state.
Right.
And I think that that's one of the challenges with music and with this Dionysian and this very divine energy, is that we don't have the ritual for the come down. We don't have the ritual, the prescribed sort of, now what do you do with that? In an organized.
Sherilyn, wouldn't you say that we can't suppress our shadow complexes? We have to, in a way, let them possess us, or we just have to recognize that they are there. Right?
I absolutely think that. I just think that when you combine the fact that, we have these two really confected dichotomy, right? You're either this good, and I'm not saying that we believe this here, but this sort of cultural thing, we're either this good Christian or this occult practitioner, and there's never the twain shall meet, So if you're kind of sort of possessed by these energies, how do you let them move through your body without this full repentance thing and going back to this orthodoxy? We don't really have that sort of bridge. Now, if you pile on a lot of drugs and alcohol on top of it and casual sex.
But we kind of do have the bridge, actually. The bridge is, I think, one of the things that we haven't been talking about, which is the bridge, is that for the musician or for the Dionysian cultist it's happening within the context of performance. And
for the artist, yes.
Right, yes, sorry. So and that's maybe what's missing on this other end, is that for the musician, the performative aspect of, quote, being possessed. But the truth of the matter is, once the lights come up and everybody's just like, oh, I gotta go home, and
closing time.
Arthur Brown told this great story that's in the book. He was really funny. So Arthur Brown was the musician who did, I'm the God of Hellfire, the song Fire, right? And he starts with, I am the God of Hellfire, fire, and he has the crown with the flames. Very popular musician in the 60s. And this was his shtick. Like he believed that when he was performing, he was acting in a shamanistic role. And he says this very explicitly. He believed that he was, he had the colored robes, and there's definitely, the way in which he used color and sound. He really believed that all of this was to induce a change of consciousness in the audience and to create a shamanic moment. And he said he was walking home one day. Actually, he was he was on his way home from the store, and there were these kids around, and they knew him. They're like, "Hey, God of Hellfire!" They were joshing him. And he rang the buzzer to be let into his building. And his wife upstairs said, "Did you get everything?" And he had, "Oh no, I forgot the milk." And the kids burst out laughing. The God of Hellfire forgot the bloody milk. And so that banality of the lived life, and then this incredibly potent, magical moment of the performative, right? Those are not necessarily opposed to each other, right? We live in the world, so we have to get the milk. But there's a sense in which that possession, because it's happening within the context of this performative ritual, that's the place. Those are the safe places that I think something like, they would have in a voodoo ritual, that, you're not getting in stories of the young girl who's possessed by a demon, right? Right. So those are happening outside the context of ritual, outside the context of an initiatory moment, outside of a performative moment. Ritual is still performative, even when it's happening within the context of a religious rite.
Of course.
Right. So I think that's really interesting what you're saying, Sherilyn, about that.
Thank you. I got to see that because I worked in live music for 3 years in the 90s, and I was lucky enough to see most of the shows fairly sober anyway, because I was working. But most of the people that were watching were not, And so I just look back at that and I think about how, again, in a culture where we don't have guardrails you might have these Dionysian, this ecstatic, this thing, but you're not going home to a family. You're not having to make sure the crops come in. You don't have these very grounding experiences of responsibility to more than just yourself. And, so many people have been, quote, saved by it, right? It's transformed people's lives, but people also get lost in it. And we're just in that, I think we're in this moment where we're between these two. Again, this phrase keeps coming to mind, confected dichotomy, where they're not really opposed, but we've been made to feel like, you can choose this over here or choose that over there. And we're all having to kind of find our individual way, which is great. It's beautiful, but it's also pretty chaotic. So
yeah. And it's also there's no way to get into the weeds with the ways in which, certain kinds of magical practice has also been a part of normative religion for a long, long time. In a book I did after Season of the Witch called Strange Frequencies, I wrote about this incredible discovery. I wasn't the first person to make it, but there's a lot of great scholars who have done this work about, the magical practices of the early Mormons.
Mm-hmm.
And, whatever you think about Mormonism, these were practicing magicians who used seeing stones and were scryers and magical treasure hunters, and these traditions of magic, whether it's medieval Jews putting up amulets to protect against Lilith, who might come steal their babies, to the Renaissance mages, who were all devout Christians, right? So there's a law, and then if you want to talk, you could easily, I think, it would be, I'm not the person to do it, but you probably know more about this than I do, Miguel, but I wonder if there's a case to be made that certain forms of Pentecostal practice could appear magic in terms of the whole history of how that term gets used, right?
Or a mystery religion.
Exactly.
Right. Scholars have noticed it. It has all the bells and whistles of a mystery religion.
Well,
Go down, God possession.
Yeah,
that was my point. That's what I had personally witnessed, is they're calling in these energies and then they're banishing them. They're not just sitting there going, oh, darn, I have a demon today. No, they're there to experience that and to have the transcendent, ecstatic fall out on the floor and then call this other. I mean, that is what it's for. It's not just some, accidental thing. That's why it exists. It exists for that ritual.
And sometimes with gods that can be mercurial and trickstery, right? And so that's hard. Like, that's hard work to do that with a god like that, or with Dionysus, or with even
with these demons that these Christians are saying, it was always a question. Well, did we get the whole demon out? Well, the demon followed me home, and the demon is here, and the demon is there, and it's like we're so far outside of what you all think your orthodoxy is. And it's interesting. So I think all these different religions, as you're saying, are sects. All you have to do is dig just a little bit, and you'll find that it's infused with these, syncretic, occultic. The guy that founded the Jehovah's Witnesses, the same thing. He's buried under a giant black pyramid. Why? So it's interesting that I've just been reading the Kurt Seligman book, The Mirror of Magic. And just showing kind of that history in the Roman Empire times of how basically, each emperor would come along and then now they're the magicians and the bad guys. Right. Our practices are okay. It was basically whatever favored the hierarchy. Then everybody else was a magician.
I mean, this happened even within communities themselves. So, for example, the black, African Americans who were slaves, who adopted, often by force, this Christian religion, and in some ways practiced that religion secretly, using some of the traditions of their African heritage, would then later be worried about their own community members that were playing the fiddle, because that was then. So you have it contained, and then you create an orthodoxy around it, and then things that used to once be an integral part of, say, like the more raw or early forms of that, then become a form of something that needs to be, either exiled or mistrusted. I think we see that, which is wonderful. And I don't know if you've seen Sinners yet.
No, I can't wait.
But
it's going to be free on Max next week.
So that film deals very explicitly with a lot of what we're talking about.
Yes, I can't wait to see it.
And there's this question about the role of music in the church that's really essential to that film. That I think, I'd love to hear what you think about after you see it.
I am. I'm very, very excited about that.
Sherilyn, did you see Sinners yet?
No, I didn't, and I had heard a lot about it and the reviews, and it's sort of one of these things where it's kind of comes at this historical moment of rising racial tensions, and I thought, okay, why don't you just throw a match on it? That's a good idea.
I'm fine. The Irish are the bad guys. I'm always
Always.
fine with the
No,
Irish.
actually, no,
Oh,
not at
okay.
all.
I thought
mean,
it. Well, I haven't seen
well,
it.
it's complicated. It's very
Yeah,
complicated.
I like movies
It's
like
very
that, morally
complicated. So,
ambiguous,
yes,
just
it's
trying
very
to show.
complicated.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think I think it was an incredible film. It's many different movies within the movie, but I think in terms of taking up this subject, especially talking about the early, development of rock and roll, it's really essential viewing.
I'm trying to remember what movie it was. Was it The Color Purple, where they kind of showed this dichotomy of the speakeasy and that was earlier. I'm trying to remember what movie it was. It was pretty popular in the 80s, but they kind of went into this where they would show the sort of Black community and that dichotomy between the church and the what is the club called? I'm sorry, the name's escaping me. It's not the honky tonk. They didn't call it the honky tonk. Something else. They were showing this, sort of. I'll remember it here in a minute. It's not The Color Purple. That was before, I think.
Yeah, I mean, because sometimes these laws that the churches had were just for white people. So the blacks would have their blues or like I said, dance places. And then the whites would go there because
right,
where all the fun was, right? That's where all the magic was. So
yeah,
it was kind of normal in the South. But Peter, at the same time, we were talking about, going home and all that and doing your job. Obviously, Bowie was never one of the, when he was Ziggy Stardust, he was Ziggy Stardust or Thin White Duke or, God forbid, the bleach blonde doing his Let's Dance. But at the same time, it seems when we're writing books, we're doing, I don't know, an important job because, for example, the Elvis fandom doesn't want to listen to my book. They're doing this blah, 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 blah. First they ignore you, then they mock you because they have a view of Elvis. Even though when you go to Graceland, you see the Buddha statues and his occult books. And it's right there, but everybody has this view. And this seems to be this idea that the society has been programmed to think that, these were just eccentricities, that, Ronald Reagan did astrology and the Beatles dabbled with Hinduism and all that. And Bowie was kind of into Kabbalah and all that. But the truth is, these alternative traditions or experiential traditions or occult were essential to their music, to their personality. They were essential to them changing society. And I think it gets pretty marginalized, won't you think? And it's good that we keep having to bang the drum.
Yep. And there's reasons though for people to also be skeptical. When you did a lot of these bands, a lot of like the metal bands in the 70s, were sort of, you throw an upside down pentagram on your album cover because it's going to sell. Maybe you have a copy of the Necronomicon, the Avon Necronomicon on your bookshelf, and so all that's fun and there's nothing wrong with that. It's still I think participating generally in this landscape that was a very important part of culture at the time. So when we're talking about the musicians though that really I think were either practitioners or used that imagery or ideas in the way in which they understood themselves or their music, those I think are a little bit dotted around the landscape as opposed to the more general, Ozzy Osbourne, for example, he even people would ask him at the end of his shows, so you worship the devil? He's like, I'm just having some fun, man, like this is. And does he, however, in the moment when they're performing and he has the explosions and he's wearing the priestly outfit and the thing, there's still something happening between him and the audience that's real, right? So he's still shaping consciousness via this performance. But I don't know if it's necessarily true that he himself thinks about it in those terms, except that he understands the power as a performer of what it means to use those symbols and to sing about the things he sings about, that creates this kind of hypnotic, experience and I think altered consciousness experience.
Yeah. And at the same time, you don't even have to go to the occult, because there were things that were fringe in the 60s. Science fiction, comic books. We see them as mainstream, but these were fringe, high weirdness, spiritual,
absolutely. Yep.
American modalities that these rock stars tapped into.
Yes, UFOs, right? All that, very important. And we see a lot of that starts to kind of congeal together in after the end of the 60s, which, maybe the Aquarian Age consciousness didn't quite pan out as the way people hoped. And it took a lot of time. I think the 70s were I will say, for the record, I think the 1970s was the single greatest decade for music, but I will also say that it was a very dark time, culturally. And in terms of spiritual movements, it wasn't until a lot of this stuff returned in the form of the New Age movement, but it had a slightly different gloss on it. It was less psychedelic. Mm-hmm. It was a little bit more, I guess, I don't want to call it suburban, but certainly cleaner, right? And more for, I think it had a little bit more middle class appeal, right? Than the 60s psychedelic movement did, or the 60s spiritual movement. You didn't have to hang out with the dirty hippies. You could go to your nice New Age bookstore and get your crystals and your Windham Hill records, and all that's fine. I don't mean to sound like I'm making fun.
I love.
Yeah.
So, and that itself, there's a whole, what's interesting though is if you look at the history of New Age music though, which is another important form of spiritual music, a lot of that we can trace back to the experimental musicians and people like Brian Eno and,
of course,
right, and ambient. So again, nothing's in a vacuum. It's all these trajectories of the way in which people are looking to mold and adapt their spiritual understandings with the music and with the culture.
Yeah, very well said. I have to bring this up. You're talking about Brian Eno, and of course, yeah, people make fun of glam rock. They don't realize glam rock reoriented rock, brought it back to its roots. It was for the working class. It was raw. I know John Lennon called it rock and roll with lipstick, but like you said, glam rock then moved into punk and then to new wave. All these things are working together. And I love this quote by Elvis Costello, and they ask him, well, how did new wave come around? Elvis Costello goes, oh, well, the punkers learned to play their instruments. Right. I don't know, that makes me laugh so much. It's kind of true. As you see Blondie, like at first, like, and then suddenly they have a rhythm.
The movie, I think somebody in the chat got it, Cotton Club. I think that was the name of the movie.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And then the
Richard Gere? Is that the Richard Gere?
No, I think he was. No. I mean, this was in the 80s, like 84. Okay. I mean, it was back there. And then it was Juke Joints, right? Is that what they called it? And then a couple of comments. One is, so Black Sabbath. Recently, a friend of mine on his show, he played a version of War Pigs that was just a piano version, just a guy at the piano, just singing it and playing the piano. And when all you can hear is this beautiful melody and just the lyrics, you're thinking this is one of the most astute commentaries on, resist on what these oppressors want to do to you and how they manipulate power and how you can push it. So
Black Sabbath was not a satanic band. They're actually Christian moralists, if you really
right. And I've heard other people do experiments with, I don't know, people throughout, who we have historical records of are supposed to be doing bad things. And then if you just listen to their whole speeches or without all of the scary music, you go, oh, that's what they were saying. That's not so.
Exactly.
But then there is an interview with, it's one of the bandmates from Black Sabbath talking about that, I don't know, somebody was interfacing with some practice. I don't know if it was Ozzy Osbourne or somebody else, but they said that the poltergeist activity got so bad in wherever they were recording, they basically ran out. They couldn't. So it's sort of back to this theme
Probably
of
Switzerland. There's a lot of haunted places, and
is
yeah,
that
bands
what
like
I don't,
David Bowie and Deep Purple would go to these chalets, and
yeah.
they
So
would.
I mean, again, you might not be like, oh, we're Satanists, and or the Christians think they're Satanists because they have these funny costumes, but that when you are channeling these energies, things happen, that you may not have intended, and may not be the sweetness and light. And I think that's the comment about the New Age. It sort of got repackaged in a way that suburban moms could just go to the bookstore and get a crystal and have a nice, and it seems a safe way to do the occult, right? Whereas these other ways, the guardrails were a little less guaranteed. So.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Black Sabbath has that beautiful ballad, "It's All Right." It's one of my favorite songs, and it's the most beautiful piano guitar. So, yeah, great movement, great band too, and yeah, the chat's always a lot of Black Sabbath fans there, so it's good to hear that. And what do you think of Peter? What happened later in the 80s and 90s? Do you think rock is dead? I mean, is the occult still there? I know you write in your book about, Beyonce and all these people using Freemason, Illuminati symbols and all that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a lot of that shticky, fooling around. I mean, I just don't think there's anything to it. I don't think they're part of any cabal. I just don't, I think a lot of it's just, it's they know they're going to get the views. They know they're going to get people talking about it.
Right.
I mean, now it's a totally different scene. There are many, I think there are many more vocal, what I would call artist practitioners. These are people, many are working, I think, within like folk magic traditions or Wiccan traditions. There's a lot of musicians that are doing that. There's certainly, the black metal folks. Again, I can't say what anybody's actual practice is, but I do know that within certain, there's a lot of music coming out of England where I think a lot of the folks are, again, I would say that they embed practice into their creative output. I don't know. I don't think rock is dead, but again, I don't think we could ever have anything like what we had, say, like with Zeppelin or with Bowie. I think any music that's going to do that is probably going to be in a different genre. I think it's probably more going to happen within the context probably of hip hop or rap. I think, there are bands there that, and especially with access to, electronic equipment and things like that. I just think in terms of, the kind of classic 4-piece rock band, there's plenty, and plenty of them are great. There's some really wonderful bands that are just, I listen to, there's a band called the OCs. I don't know if you've heard of them, the OCs. They're terrific. And there's a lot of sort of within that, almost sort of like a garage psych sound that's doing some really amazing things. But I think in terms of the 4-piece rock band being able to have the impact that a band like Led Zeppelin had on culture, maybe I'm just because I'm old and I just don't know if that could happen. But I certainly think that there are other forms of music maybe that just haven't even been sort of created yet that might be able to have that kind of cultural impact.
Yeah, and do you see any parallels with Kanye and Bowie? Because in the book I put out a lot. Yeah, I mean, Bowie was fascinated with occult Nazism. He blatantly put his foot in his mouth many times in the press that Hitler was a good leader. England would need. Yeah, I mean, he would do well with it. He was just all over the place,
and he is very hated that about himself later. And
of course,
yeah. I mean, I don't know about parallels. With Kanye, I just think, again, it's just the way in which, I also think that musicians of a certain type are always looking for ways to be as shocking as possible. I don't think it's even that deep. I think it's just, trying to push people's buttons and get people talking about them. And because that's the thing is we talk about it and then that makes them feel like they've had an impact. but it's not a gesture that it's just ugly, and it's not. I don't think it's. I think for Bowie, the only difference I would say for Bowie is that he maybe even more dangerously thought about it in a way that I think for Kanye is just insanity.
Yeah. I mean, Bowie was, of course, struggling at the time.
Yes.
The
cocaine,
death of his father, the abuse of his mother. He had a lot of issues that he thought fame and money was going to cure, and they did not cure him. And again, the shadow came out. Call it his persona, the shadow, and it completely took over him. And he started projecting this for years out into his music and to other people, to the press. So yeah, classic underworld, like you said, underworld, going into the underworld, and you face your demons. They either destroy you or you alchemize your demons, and you get out of Hades. So Bowie did it. Like you said,
absolutely.
Elvis couldn't do it. Morrison couldn't do it. So many can't do it, but Bowie was able to do it.
That's right.
I just listened to an interview recently with a journalist that had spent a few days interviewing Kanye West, and his take on it was that it was in the Andy Kaufman vein. He's like, he knows exactly what he's doing. He gets a look in his eye. He looks at the camera. He starts saying the incendiary stuff, and then he goes back to, whatever. So it's interesting how musicians and people use these, as you were saying. I mean, the number one thing they need to do is stay in front of us and have us talk about
stay relevant. Exactly.
Yeah, I only say Kanye because I'm not a big fan of hip hop, but his music, there was something about Kanye. I don't know. He is dipping into some other dimension because he's so talented, and I feel his music, which is something that very few artists can do. It's like they're tapping into another dimension. He has that talent and that mysticism. The question is, what going into the darkness, will he come back? So I was just curious, and comparing him with Bowie, who had a similar trajectory, if you know what I mean. So the Nazi salutes in public and all, we're dealing with the same thing, right, Peter? Elon Musk, Bowie. No, I wasn't doing anything. No, you're wrong.
Right. Exactly.
Well, at least I know what to do to get noticed. You want more viewers? I guess you just do that, and everybody is going to talk about you. Kind of an easy formula. Somebody just said in the chat that both Bowie and Kanye counseled or sought out Jodorowsky. Had you heard about that? Alejandro Jodorowsky.
No, I would imagine. I wouldn't. That sounds perfectly reasonable. Yeah.
Is he still alive? I keep thinking that I don't know if I'm stuck in a Mandela thing with him, because I keep thinking he died from 10 years ago. Did he pass away? Is he still alive?
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure. It's been a while since I've watched his flicks.
Looks like he's still alive.
That is just, it really is one of those Mandela things. I really thought he passed away several times. But if you all have never seen Jodorowsky's Dune, it's such an incredible, it's a documentary about, because he always wanted to make Dune. That was his lifelong dream. And it is a really glorious film about people's journeys through their, through creation, what you want to create.
Yeah.
Really recommended.
We'll have to check it out. Yeah, on the Bowie thing you're talking about, what's the story as we get to the end of this interview that Jimmy Page went to his apartment, and he was with his girlfriend Bowie at the time, Ava Cherry, sorry. And Jimmy Page spilled some wine on the couch and said, "Oh, your girlfriend spilled it." And Bowie caught it. And then Jimmy Page did this to him. And Bowie's like, "My God, he's trying to control my mind." So they sat there for an hour trying to control each other's mind. Of course, they're both high. And they sat there, and I wish I could just recreate that in a movie. Then eventually Jimmy Page leaves, and Bowie's like, "Holy mother." And he starts runs to the bookstore, buys all these books on Kabbalah and magic, and he's scrying all these Kabbalistic things in his apartment. And eventually, the story, he somehow, to escape evil, he goes to LA. which is the worst place you could
Exactly.
go for occultism, and all that, and drugs.
Well, I always say the lesson we learned from David Bowie is don't mix your Kabbalah with cocaine.
Bad news.
Yeah. So awesome. Yeah, we are getting at the end. Do you have any last questions there, Sherilyn?
No, I really appreciate your insights, Peter. I look
Yeah,
forward
no,
to
it's been
your book
terrific talking to you both.
All of your books. Wow. I mean, it's quite a corpus. It's amazing.
Very true. Yeah, can't wait till your book about monsters. That's gonna bring back a lot of memories. God, and the archetypes and the myths and what it's tapping to. It's going to be amazing. And you don't have a website, right? You and I have just chatted.
No, I mean, I mostly post on Instagram these days if people are looking for me. That's where, and I have a page of links off of that. So for things that are coming up, talks, and I'm giving things like that.
Awesome. Well, yeah, check it out, and definitely check his books. Yeah, somebody bringing Dio. Yeah, big fan of Ronnie James Dio here. Somebody who really knew how to play with these images and powers. So yeah, good stuff. And check out what else do I have on my end? Not much. Of course, please support the show in any way you can, whether you're my personal channel or the AM Byte. Like, subscribe, leave a review, whatever. For those of you who've asked, you can get signed copies of the Elvis book through my Substack. Check out the levels there. And that's really about it. I think that's it. Well, first, I would like to say, Sherilyn, always cool to hang with you. Thanks for making it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Miguel. Nice meeting you, Peter.
Oh, great to meet you. Thank you both. Really enjoyed this.
Really enjoyed it too, Peter. Thanks for everything you do. For the audience, as always, great comments. Some songs of metal that I need to re-listen to. And yes, we shall end it right now. Yeah, keep rocking. Keep rocking. Take care, everybody.
Good night.